Hello, everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Kaushik Gangopahdyay. Dr. Kaushik Gangopahdyay is an assistant professor, stage 3 in the Department of Archaeology, University of Calcutta from 2013, and he had also served as a fellow at the Center for Archaeological Studies and Training, Eastern India from 2004. He received MA degree from Deccan College Postgraduate and Research Institute 1997, Pune, and PhD from the Department Ancient Indian History, Culture and Archaeology, Utkal University, Bhubaneswar, Odisha. The current academic interest of Dr. Gangopahdyay is maritime archaeology and archaeological sciences. He has experience in archaeological fieldwork of nearly 25 years in India, including explorations and excavations. And he has also worked at archaeological excavations with Museum of London Archaeology, MOLA, in London. He has co-directed excavations in 2008 and directed excavations from 2013 at the sites of Erenda and Bahiri in coastal West Bengal. He has been conducting projects funded by the ICHR, UGC, and DST SHRA. He published several articles and 2 edited books. His recent publications with his collaborators are in the Journal of Archaeological Sciences Reports, Radiocarbon, Holocene, and also Journal of Radioanalytical and Nuclear Chemistry. He has been the Nehru UK Visiting Fellow of the Nehru Trust of Victoria and Albert Museum, UK 2017. He is a member of Asiatic Society of Bengal and World Archaeological Congress. With that introduction, I would like to invite Dr. Gangopahdyay to begin his talk.
Uh, Good afternoon, Srilekha, and thank you for this wonderful and very kind introduction. And first of all, I would like to thank Dr. Prabhakar and Dr. Sharada from IIT Gandhinagar for inviting me to this lecture series, and it has become one of the major events in Indian archaeology today. So I feel really privileged to have been invited. Now, when I was asked to, am I audible to all of you? Yeah, thank you.
Yes.
So, yeah, thank you so much. So, when I was asked to deliver this talk, I thought about discussing certain things which are becoming extremely critical in Indian archaeology today. And few of the institutes which are taking kind of a lead in breaking new barriers and breaking new grounds is, of course, the Center for Archaeology at IITGN. Therefore, I don't want to give you a kind of an overview of the work that I'm doing. Rather, I would place it within a kind of a question framework with which me and some of my students are working. And actually, at this stage which I'm reaching right now, it's time that slowly I start passing on the batons to my students who are asking new questions. And it is through the interactions with some of my students that have come up with some new ideas. And therefore, I thought that I'll be sharing with you the work that we have been doing. And the work which I'm going to present to you, it's not only my work, although I'll be acknowledging most of them, but some of them may be missed out. So I apologize at the very outset. So it's a work of many people. And we present as a team, either as a team or as individuals. But I would at the outset like to state that it's not my work alone, but work of several of my students, several of my collaborators from Calcutta and also elsewhere in India and also outside. Some of them are stationed outside. So I thank all of them for this collaboration, and I begin my talk. So I'll be just sharing my screen at this moment. So, yes, I think now it works fine.
Yes.
All right. So the topic, and I may have to put off my video feed because of the internet problems if I face some of them in the course of this lecture. So anyways, the topic that I have in mind today is understanding coastal settlements in West Bengal, methodologies and interpretations. Now, specifically, you may notice that I have not introduced or kept the term archaeological, because coastal settlements in themselves are unique in their nature, and also they have connections with other settlements, non-coastal or terrestrial settlements or settlements that are located inland. So I propose to take a long term view rather than just keeping it confined within archaeological dimensions. I propose to take a much longer view. However, the data that I have gathered about on coastal settlements largely comes from archaeology. But having said that, I must remind the participants that there is a lot of ethnographic and also historical documents related with settlements. So when we talk about settlements, coastal or otherwise, we must not only keep ourselves confined within archaeology, but we must also include ethnography, historical, and all sorts of data that we may source out on a particular region or on a group of settlements from a particular region. All right. So if my slide has changed, so these are the way through which I have tried to define what do you mean by coastal settlements, right? Now, you see coastal archaeology so far in India has been confined to the study of ports, which is of course important. And also it can be placed within the scope of maritime and marine archaeology, right? Right from the time of the Indus Valley Civilization, as most of you or some of you must be aware, we have been working on ports, on marine archaeology, maritime archaeology, and many of these coastal settlements have also been found as industrial and manufacturing centers. Coastal areas can also be used to map and understand human interactions and issues of migrations, because coastal areas were the areas through which people in the past must have migrated, and it is from these regions that human interactions could have taken place. Coastal settlements are also repositories of climatic and environmental proxies, about which I'm going to talk about. And you can also retrieve some proxy data to understand issues such as sea level changes and climatic changes from coastal settlements. So, speaking overall, studying coastal settlements from a multidimensional perspective has its importance. So it's not only from historical or archaeological that we try to appreciate the coastal settlement, but even from environmental and climatic perspective, particularly the issues which are threatening us today, sea level changes. Sorry, there is a typo over there, so the A is missing. So we can study coastal settlements from various perspectives. So this is the importance, I feel, is of the coastal settlements. Having said all this, I must emphasize that today we have not actually, in India, we have a very long coastline, and we have multicultural deposits from the prehistoric to the historical period, even to the industrial, to the colonial and industrial period. And we know that India's ancient past and even modern history has been shaped from the coast. However, even today, while we interpret India's past, if you look into the textbooks and most of the writings, coastal archaeology and understanding coastal settlements continue to be marginal in those discourses. And the reason being that at times you require from archaeological perspective, a different methodology to understand these settlements, because it is assumed that terrestrial sites are, within quotes, better preserved than coastal settlements. And therefore, there is always a tendency in researchers, amongst researchers, to study sites away from the coasts, possibly because of the issues of preservation. Secondly, as I said earlier, that in order to understand coastal settlements, there needs to be some fundamental understanding of coastal communities as archaeological communities, which can be negotiated through ethnography, ethnohistorical, and even historical data. I will try to elaborate on this point at the end of this lecture. Next slide. So, I'm just coming down to the topic which I'm going to discuss. So it can be broken up into three distinct parts. The first, I'll be speaking a few minutes on the general geology of the region which we are discussing right now. Secondly, I'll be talking about the archaeological data that we have retrieved. And lastly, I'll be talking about geoarchaeology, but not only from the point of view of sediments and soils, or not only from the point of view of science, but rather I would try to try to understand the geoarchaeology of coastal Bengal from from the literature which has now been published by scholars like Andrew Bauer on the scope of geoarchaeology and social sciences. I think some of you may be aware of those literature, but anyways, if you haven't, we will do it in the course of this lecture. So yeah. So these are two general maps, basic maps, which shows the state of West Bengal, and the map on the right, where my cursor is located, you can see all these quaternary deposits. So I'll be talking mostly about this region of West Bengal, which is known as Midnapur district. Because it will not be possible to cover the entire coastal zone of West Bengal today. So I'll be restricting myself largely to this area, which falls under the district of Medinipur in West Bengal. So these are the quaternary classifications based on the geological literature, and it's very easy to understand that the older landforms are located west of the Hooghly or the Ganges Delta, whereas the newest and these are as late as mid to late Holocene, even late Holocene deposits, which can be found in and around the present Ganges Delta. So I'll be talking about largely a very late geological deposit in which most of the archaeological sites which we have been working on are located, right? So it's a kind of a time scale of about 10,000 years. But having said that, if we could spend a minute on the map on the left, we could see that there's a significant difference between the early Holocene coastline, which was further inland, and then we have this late glacial maximum coastline, right? So, which means that the coastline of West Bengal has shifted. So, which means primarily that if we go back about 10 to 12,000 years ago, most of the region here would be underwater. And that was part of the Flandrian, what we call transgression, Flandrian transgression. But after that, the coast has moved further to the south, and you can see these are the time scale along the coast, which has been used by the geographer to create this map. So this entire region has been built from the alluvium of the Ganges and its distributaries over the last 6 to 7,000 years, right? However, these have not been very well dated, but the general idea is quite clear. Now, this is generally the quaternary stratigraphy about which I'm going to talk about. And in the Medinapur district, of course, it has its counterparts in other districts of coastal Bengal, such as the North and the South 24 Parganas. But in eastern Medinipur district, these are the formations which belongs to the quaternary. At the bottom, we have Sijua. Of course, there are other deposits below Sijua, which I'm not going to talk about because they belong to not to the coastal zone as such, and not related directly to archaeology of coastal region. But we can take up the story from the Sijua formation, which has been dated between Upper Pleistocene to Lower Holocene, characterized by olive gray to yellowish gray silty clay with soft iron nodules and anthills. And they are characterized by floodplain, valley fill, delta fan of the present-day river regime. And this is, as you can see, if you can see the photograph on the right-hand side, this is the Sijua deposit, which we can see, which we can see today. Exposed at certain places. And this is basically a natural surface. Our data suggests that when this particularly Sijua surface was formed, this entire area was experiencing a shallow marine environment. On top of it, we have the Paskura formation, which has been dated between 4810 years BP to 780 years BP. These are basically silt, sand, and clay. Again, characterized geomorphologically by valley fill, meander belt, delta fan deposits, and associated with present-day river regime. It is from this formation that we start getting the first archaeological deposits belonging to Proto, by which I mean Neolithic, Chalcolithic, early farming villages, early historic, early medieval, and medieval. So you can see part of the landscape, it's a much stable landscape, which is called Panskura Formation, and it is characterized by several small lakes, which are called pukur in Bengali. These are basically freshwater ponds, either naturally created or excavated by the local people. And again, we have another mid-Holocene geomorphic landform associated in coastal Midnapur, which has been characterized as ancient tidal flat and beach ridge complexes. These have been dated between 5760 to 3000 years BP, fine to very fine sand, moderately ferruginous, and overlies the Sijua, dune ridges, fluviotidal flats, and intertidal flats. And it is from this context that we start getting early historic and early medieval deposits. So far, from this deposit, we have not been able to retrieve anything earlier than the early historic. So these are the different characteristic landforms, and you can see the photographs of these landforms as taken in the field. Right. So in coastal West Bengal, this is basically the archaeological profile. The protohistory can be placed as around 952 BC, based on AMS dates from a site known as Erenda. The protohistoric pottery has also been found known as black and red ware from sites known as Tamluk and Natshal. The early historic phase can be placed between 3rd century BC and 3rd century CE. There are few dates, AMS and otherwise, from this phase as well. But largely this phase is dated, as you know, in Indian archaeology based on artifacts, which includes pottery, beads, terracotta objects, bones, and also a few metal objects like coins, including coins. And finally, early medieval. And this phase, the time scale there's a typo error. This phase can be placed between 6th century C to about 11th, 12th century C, and found at sites like Tamluk and Bahiri. Again, this particular early medieval phase is not really understood. Kindly apologize. I apologize for this typographic error. Please guide the date. It should be approximately between 6th century AD or C till about 11th, 12th century C. It is really not really understood this phase, because we are working on the pottery and other objects to have a material culture control on this particular phase. But I'll be concentrating largely on the proto and the early historic period, which happens to be a part of my area of interest. All right. So we have been trying to understand the coastal settlements from 3 perspectives, right? Land use pattern, site formation process, and site or spatial pattern within a particular site. Now, I have underscored all this, I've underlined all these because of one reason, which at times is a problematic issue in Indian archaeology. You see, sites such as coastal sites such as Tamluk have always been associated with ports and trade. Now, therein lies the problem that in culture history approach, we talk about the culture history approach, there is always an a priori labeling of the of a particular settlement even before we try to excavate or understand this. So that has been a problem riding not only archaeology of coastal settlements in Bengal, but generally archaeology of early historic settlements and also even Indus Valley settlements in all over India. I will say it's largely limited or largely pertinent to early historic period, mostly because of this colonial historiography, something that was started by Mortimer Wheeler at Arikamedu when he labeled that particular site as Indo-Roman site. So this Indo-Roman trade and the Indian Ocean trade and the attempts to identify ports has largely overshadowed other important aspects of coastal settlement. So I'm not saying that it's not important. We need to study ports also as archaeological sites. But over the years, the historiography, if you look at the historiography from the colonial period onwards, it has largely been about ports and the Indian Ocean trade and the Indo-Roman trade. But other aspects of coastal settlements, which I have tried to highlight here, have been largely ignored. So coming to the methodology, right? Of course, geoarchaeology is the primary methodology that we have used, which includes mapping using modern techniques of GIS. Also, we have been trying to extract some stable isotope and getting out some stable isotope studies from some of the sites, and a lipid analysis of artifacts. Ethnoarchaeology, which in fact I will not be talking about in this lecture today, but I'll be briefing out and I'll be briefly stating why it is an important aspect of this entire methodological spectrum at the end of the lecture. But I'll be spending a little more time on what we know as single context recording. In archaeological literature, you will be you are more familiar with the term Harris matrix, but I'll not use the term Harris matrix. Rather, I'll go by the Mola handbook and use the term single context recording, which of course is part of the Harris matrix methodology. But this single context recording is something that I have found useful while studying the ancient coastal settlements in Bengal, and I'll be speaking a little more about it in this lecture. All right. Okay. So coming to this district of Medinipur, this is the quaternary atlas of the Geological Survey of India. You can see this region where my cursor is largely the coastal zone of Midnapur, and bordering this coastal zone. So this is basically the Panchkura formation, as we were talking about. If you have got what I was trying to tell you a few slides ago. And this yellow, this area is basically the Sijua formation. And you can see this kind of fingering taking place, which means this is an erosional landscape. So this Sijua has eroded and the Panchkura has ingressed into it. So stratigraphically, as I've shown you, Sijua would be here. Sijua would be at the bottom and topped by the Panchkura formation, which is related to mid-Holocene phase. So this is the geological situation. And the major drainage of the Midnapur district is, of course, the Subarnarekha River. And in the south and to the north, we have the Rupnarayan River. I'll be showing a few more slides which will show this river in a better way. And to the south, we have the Bay of Bengal, right? So the sites which I'm going to talk about are located in this terrain. All right. So the first site which I'm going to talk about is located on the Rupnarayan River, which I've just showed you. It lies at the very northwest of the Midnapur district. And it is south of the famous site of Tamluk, famous because it has been associated with the famous site of Tamralipti in ancient literature. Okay. All right. So this is the river of Rupnarayan, as you can see. So this is the district of Midnapur, and this is the river Rupnarayan, and Tamluk is located here. But I'm not going to talk about Tamluk because I'm not going to talk about ports today. But rather, I'll go downstream and talk about a site which is called Natshal. And this site will probably help me to impress upon you that why coastal settlements as archaeological sites are difficult and challenging to study. So these are some of the sites which you can see. So Tamluk, Ichapur, Natshal, this site I'm going to talk about. And the site belongs to, based on ceramics and other objects, we have placed this site between proto-history and early historic period, but there is some medieval material also. This is a term which is not really familiar to some of us doing archaeology in India, although it is practiced quite extensively elsewhere. So it means that these sites are located between the low and high tide. So this river Rupnarayan experiences a significant tidal range. At times it's about 4 meters above. So the high tide goes 4 meters above sea levels, 4 to 5 meters above sea level, and falls even below the sea levels at times. So this is a diurnal or daily affair So the tide comes and goes out twice a week or twice a day, sorry. And at times the tidal range is very high. So you can understand it's a 5-meter tidal range. So when the tide is high, you will not be able to see this site. It's only when the tide goes down that you find artifacts in the section and in the area where the tide has receded. So this is you can see this is the photograph of the section at high tide, whereas there's the same section at low tide. So you can immediately understand the difference in the tidal level at each, and it happens on a daily basis. Twice a day it happens, and it is within this context that we start getting artifacts. So this is a example of an intertidal site from the Rupnaran estuary. And there are several sites like this located in coastal settlements. The issue is, again, how do you study sites like this? So we started to adopt a kind of a geoarchaeological methodology to study this site. And first of all, we mapped the site by using GIS. And we not only mapped the drainage, but we also took a data for over 100 years and tried to see the kind of erosion and deposition that has taken place around the site. So this is one methodology that is very important from the point of view of coastal archaeology and coastal settlements, that if you have data for now, we can use data for about 100 years, and we have different varieties of maps, including old topo sheets of 1921. We have colonial maps. We have even the air photographs. We have the satellite images. So and also the Google Earth images. So you can use GIS to combine the data of about 100 years now. And it's important to see what kind of landscape change has taken place over the last 100 years. And it shows, at nutshell, there has been a significant land loss. You can see this is the green part, a significant land loss around nutshell. And these are the bank lines. These green lines are different bank lines over the last 100 years. So it is due to this land loss that older sites, which were buried under the later alluvium, later deposits, that they have been now exposed. So initially, the idea, when people started to look at this site, they would think that artifacts have been flown down the river because of the river flow and river action. But our study, it pointed out that it's not river action which has led to this, but rather it's the geomorphological changes that has led to the burial of the site. The site has been buried under later alluviation, and it is re-exposed because of the river erosion. So this is the section, as you can see, of the site at nutshell, between 0 to 2.5 meters. And you get large number of non-transported pottery, followed by pottery, which are rolled. And finally, we have the non-artifactual or deposits, which can be associated with the present day. Now, the question is how to study them and what are the objects that normally you will be able to retrieve from sites like this. You have, of course, artifacts, and it's a clear artifact. It's a pottery, and looking at its typology, it can be placed in the early historic period, which is a fine gray ware. But what about these kind of objects which you find along the section? They look like iron objects, and at times you may be mistaken and you may be labeling them as a result of iron manufacturing, but unfortunately they are not. They are naturally occurring objects called rhizoconcretions. They are basically iron concretions that develop along the roots of old trees, right? And because of the tidal fluctuation, they look like iron objects. So coastal settlements do have objects which they look like artifacts, but actually they are a result of natural processes. So one who's studying coastal settlements needs to be aware of the typical objects that occur in a kind of a tidal situation. So this site, for example, you can see clearly, this is if you can see it in this slide, it's a kind of a structural base, possibly terracotta tiles. But above, what is interesting is this, above the tide, above this structural phase, we have a thick layer of pottery, which we found in rolled conditions, which means that the site was regularly getting disturbed because of water, but they were not being transported, but they were horizontally displaced. And in order to understand it better, we took a section scraping and artifacts which we collected could tell us something about the date. But more importantly, ceramics, particularly artifacts, were studied for the degree of age roundedness. Now, this I think was for the first time in India that I was able to do this, because initially people would look at ceramics and study them from various point of view, typology, etc., etc. But there are only few examples from across the globe in which ceramics have been studied from as clasts, as part of the sedimentary matrix. This happens in prehistory, of course, when you study the rolling or how artifacts like stone tools have been rolled because of transportation. But for pottery, there is not much of literature to go by. So we studied the pottery collected from the section scraping at Nutshell. So this you can see, this is a section that we took, and these are the complete pottery at the base of this section. But along with that, we started getting very small and tiny, yes, about 2 centimeters to 3 centimeters in length, small, tiny, hundreds of potsherds, which were in different degrees of roundedness. So we studied the degree of roundedness from this particular section, and we came to the conclusion that most of the pottery sherds, although they were broken because of the water action, they were eroded, they had been subjected to the process of erosion, but they were not part of a transported assemblage. Rather, they have been locally disturbed, because if they had been subjected to long distance transport, then the roundedness, the degree of roundedness should have been much higher than it was estimated quantitatively by using a method of a geologist known as Krumben. Now, this is published, so I'll not get into the details of it, but it shows that the challenges of studying coastal settlements and the methodology to study coastal settlements are at times very different from terrestrial sites. All right. The second example, I think I have finished half an hour. Yes. The second example is from the site of Erinda, which I excavated on the behalf of the Department of Archaeology, University of Calcutta. And this site has also given us some interesting data with regard to the protohistoric phase. All right. So here, this site is a little different from the earlier site, which I showed you. Because of its location at present. You see Nutshell, the first site which we discussed, it is on the active channel. Whereas Erinda, although it was part of a tidal landscape in the past, it is now, the tidal landscape has now changed into more like a terrestrial landscape. So it's kind of a paleo coast, or an old coastal zone that we're looking at. So we can see there is a remnant mound. So mounds start forming just when you enter this earlier zone, which is called the Sijua surface, right? Over here, you will hardly find any mound, but mounds start forming, and this was part of the paleo delta of the Subarnarekha River. Nyogi, Dr. Nyogi from the GSI and IIT Kharagpur, they had carried out a study. So this entire zone was a paleo delta of this river known as Subarnarekha. But now the tidal rivers are all gone, so the site is in a different landscape or landform condition than the earlier site of Nutshell. Now at Erinda, we of course took a few trenches and we excavated according to digs and layers, not by the context recording method, but we could immediately understand that how people were using the landscape in the past. Particularly, you could see that this site of Erinda is located in the Sijua surface. And as I told you at the very beginning, the Sijua surface is basically a yellowish, sticky clay surface along with caliche nodules or calcium carbonate nodule, which has no artifact, where we do not find any artifacts. But as you can see, a thin line of Sijua is kind of, it's an intrusion into the anthropogenic layer at Erinda. So we have interpreted this as a floor. And interestingly, this floor was made by the people by the ancient people of belonging to the protohistoric phase. I'll come to the dates a few slides later of the protohistoric period by using the clay of Sijua. It means that they found the Sijua clay along with calcium carbonate much more stable than the landscape on which they were trying to establish the settlement, which was basically still being formed. And you can see from its color, it's basically silty clay, and its color and composition tells us that it was basically from possibly a kind of a tidal situation or tidal landscape, which means that in order to stabilize the landscape, stabilize the place where they were living, people were using clay from an earlier deposit or deposit which lies below at particular at this place. And this is something that I would request you to keep this in mind, about which we will going to talk about at the end of this, towards the end of this lecture. And again, we found associative objects, pottery, bones. Particularly, you can see there's a dish on stand, right? So these are different contexts. Although at this site, we did not follow the single context recording method, but we tried to understand the associations between artifacts, or not only artifacts themselves, but also associations between them, and association between artifacts and ecofacts. Okay, so as you can see that the site of Erenda is the first dated site from coastal West Bengal, right? We have no other dates from coastal West Bengal. So this was the first time that we were reporting, and this has been published in radiocarbon. So the earliest date of Erenda, as you can see, it goes back. So this is number from Dig 17, right? Okay. And you can see this is from 1980 BC, which we have not accepted this date, right? Rather, we have accepted this date of 632 BC, right? And there are other dates of, I think there's a, all right, yeah. So this is 950 BC. From ZA1, we have a date of 950 BC. So this date we have not accepted because of, we think it's a problematic issue. So we have discarded the older date, but it has been published in radiocarbon. So we have explained why we have not accepted this older date, but rather this younger date of 950 BC coming from dig number 20 from trench ZA1. So this would be the earliest. So this is trench ZA1, and this is the earliest date of Erenda, that is placed with 950 BC, and then we have dates from 644 BC, right, and also other dates beyond that as well. So what's important is this, that these dates tell us that not only when coastal West Bengal was first settled, but if you look at the So we undertook a study of stable isotopes and also organic geochemistry, and this has been published in Holocene. So if someone of you wants to look up this article, I'll be happy to share with you. So I will not get into the details of that study because it has already been published, along with study of phytoliths, which also reported several taxas of domesticated as well as wild crop taxas. What is interesting here is this, that we have active habitation zone. This is the active habitation zone. And then what we learned from this study is this, that the site turned into a dumping ground, right, in a wetland situation from an active habitation zone. And the organic geochemical studies and stable isotopes show that the C3 and C4 plants are quite prevalent. And in fact, we have come to the conclusion that some of these plants, such as weeds, were actually brought in by the people, by the protohistoric people, or what you can call the early farming culture people, or the Neolithic, Chalcolithic people. There are different terms that we now use in Indian archaeology, right? And use these plants to build their habitation, right? So we get this active habitation. But afterwards, something happened due to which this area was turned into a kind of a dumping ground. So this again is an interesting result, which geochemical and geoarchaeology can tell us about how people were behaving on their landscape. And again, this is something that I'm going to talk about at the end of my lecture. And now I come to my last site, which we are excavating presently, the site of Bahiri. And this site is again very near to the Bay of Bengal. And again, there is a kind of one is provoked rather to call this a port site, right? Because of its association because of its time scale, its nearness to the sea, and also the material objects that we are getting. For example, the roulated ware, etc., etc. So it could have acted as a port, but here again, it's not only the port aspect that we're going to discuss about. So this again, it's a site which has been used for a long period of time. So it was established in 2000. We have dates from about 282 BC, the earliest phase at Erinda, but then it was never abandoned. The latest archaeological monument from this site is a temple which is dated to the 16th century. So it's a site that was continuously occupied and it was never abandoned. But what's interesting is that this site is located within the Paleo dune ridges, about which I talked about at the beginning of this talk, right? So this is the area where we went and we are excavating presently. And this year also we are going back, possibly next month or end of this month. And this is again the general map of the site and the Google Earth image and a topographic, the contour map, as we have to do before we start excavations. And you can see the trenches here. But what's interesting about this site is that we adopted purely a single context recording method in order to study the stratigraphy. Right. So before discussing about it for a minute, let me just show you about the site. So this, for example, is the early historic level. As you can see by the pottery, it was initially from the pottery that we identified it is an early historic site, but later we have also received dates which we haven't published, but I can tell you that the earliest dates go back to 282, calibrated 282 BC, which we have done through IUSC, New Delhi. And then we have early medieval structures, very clearly early medieval structures, and lying above the early historic level. All right, so initially we did a general vertical stratigraphy, and we dug through several areas within the site and had a stratigraphic drawing made. But then we shifted, or rather, we not only shifted, from the very beginning, we had this single context recording system in mind. So just to let you know how contexts are identified, they are not identified in a vertical section, rather, they are identified on a horizontal section. And as you can see, these are the line marks of the context which we have identified, and then you excavate these contexts differently. So your trench looks a little hodgepodge than the traditional method of excavation by layers, but this is what we did, and we were able to identify different contexts, starting with larger contexts and also very small contexts within few meters. And you can easily see that we could identify objects along with other artifacts. So artifacts and ecofacts, they were all associated together. For example, you see a plate, a jug, a bone piece, right? So we could document them more carefully while we were undertaking this single context recording. And this, I think, works very well on a coastal site, which, as you can see, it's not very deep. It's not a very deeply stratified site. It's only about, the main stratigraphy goes about 4 meters, but the major early historic deposit is about 1 meters. So therefore, we adopted, first of all, the single context recording method, and we could excavate by context, because the layers was not telling us much about the site. It's rather the contexts which told us a lot about the sites, and we are working on the material, and will be coming out with more publications on this in few months' time. All right, so this is the matrix diagram, and people who are not really familiar with this diagram, or who were accustomed with the traditional layer marking system, I have placed both of them to you. One was this earlier stratigraphic, this traditional way of depicting a stratigraphy, following the Mortimer-Wheeler or Wheeler-Kenoyan method. But this is the matrix diagram of contexts, and you can see that all these contexts they have been excavated, and artifacts, ecofacts, sediment, soils have been collected from each of them, and we are trying to understand the relationship spatially as well as vertically, horizontally as well as vertically. So we did find some structural remains, right? This is a finial, right, under bricks, and we did find some brick layers over here. And of course, lots of pottery, antiquities, including terracotta objects, beads. Now I come to the end of 5 minutes. Last 5 minutes would be interpretation of all these. I have tried to tell you something about the methodology which we have been using, but now how do you interpret these contexts? How do you interpret the sites that we are looking at? Because as you must have understood, in the coastal area, we have sites in different contexts, right? Some of them are intertidal, some of them are within dunal context, some of them are on the paleo-tidal regime, within the paleo-tidal regime. So how do you understand all these differently placed sites, although they were contemporary in time? So these contexts, first of all, they tell us the change in the land use pattern over time, right? So at Bahiri, for example, we have been able to understand two types of land use. One, land filling, and then deposition, right? So in a coastal zone, you need to have a landfill in order to stabilize your landscape. And so as you can see, we have also identified anthropogenic activities such as structural activities, landfilling, discard locations, appearing as distinct contexts through time, right? So this is what I was trying to tell you, that single context, without single context recording, we would not be able to understand all these different types of activities which were going on at the site, particularly landfilling and then land deposition of archaeological deposits, which includes structural activities. But within the structural activities, we have also found discard locations, right? So these have to be mapped separately, right? Within the matrix that we are trying to develop. Taskscape, right? What kind of tasks were being carried out? They included storing, cooking, and possibly ritual activities, right? So storing and cooking is quite apparent from the pottery that we have collected, and also ritual activity. Yes, other activities could have taken place, such as eating and dining and community activities, right? So artifacts such as pottery, terracotta objects are now being related to taskscape across the site, right? And the objects and artifacts, they also reveal intra-site and extra-site network. Again, I apologize for this typo. It should be network, right? So ultimately, our interpretation of this area is that it has been repeatedly used by a large community. It is not a single household, but a larger community for the purpose of storing, cooking, eating, staying, and also ritual activities. Now, who these people were, where did they come from, what kind of network this particular site had, are the questions that we are raising, and we'll be answering them or trying to answer them in future. And finally, yes, this is my last area of discussion. Just a few minutes on early and late medieval landscape of, again, coastal Midnapur district. So we use this air photographs to map the paleo channels, and we could locate some of the late medieval forts, in fact, and early medieval sites using air photographs and then also ground truthing. All right. So let me come to the end of my discussion. Coastal settlements, they have their peculiarities in terms of their geological and cultural contexts. So you can understand they are located in varied geological contexts, but their cultural contexts also differ, right? And these are attributed to sea level changes, shifting channel bars, dune sands, submerged landscapes during the late Quaternary, and calls to attention the ephemeral nature of the archaeological deposits. So this is something that one needs to take into consideration when working on coastal settlements. And archaeological deposits are seldom preserved as neatly stacked strata, but a single context, right? So at an interdadal site, you will hardly find any stratigraphy as we know it from our textbooks and even our training, but rather you can record them as single contexts and then plot it on a matrix diagram in order to understand these kind of sites. Settlements are not recorded as sites, but they are also assemblages of contexts recovered through explorations and controlled excavations, and artifacts can be explained only as part of their contexts, right? So artifacts act as both cultural and natural objects. What do I mean by this? I mean that as a nutshell, I studied the pottery not only from the typological perspective, but also as clasts. The clast is a term used for in sedimentology, in which you understand objects as part of a sedimentary matrix, right? To put it in plain words. So artifacts like pottery, right? All that has been done in prehistory, it has seldom been done in proto or early history, right? So they act as both cultural and natural objects. Fourthly, coastal behavior. We talk about behavioral archaeology, right? But there are several behavior which are peculiar to the coastal communities, such as boat making, marine and estuarine, exploiting marine and estuarine fauna, salt making. These must be part of the archaeological assemblage and discourse. In fact, we do get evidence of this kind of behavior, such as salt making from coastal Bengal, particularly from Bangladesh. They have a very good work on the salt making sites. Historical and ethno-historical knowledge, as I said at the beginning, that you need to understand the archaeological record at the backdrop of historical changes and also ethno-history, right? And then undertake or then adopt a kind of a longue durée perspective, long-term durations, or longue durée, as Brodel would put it, rather than keep it confined within a particular cultural phase, such as early historic, proto-historic, or early medieval. It's important that you take a long-term perspective. And here, historical knowledge, ethno-historical knowledge, ethnographic knowledge can also add to your understanding, such as the site like Bahiri, right? It can be contextualized within the historically contextualized by invoking this Indian Ocean trade network, which of course is not the only interpretation that the site can be subjected to. And finally, the coast is not an isolated place. It's connected to the interior hinterland, and which is equally important. Something that I did not touch upon, but objects like metal and stone objects must have been brought from outside. And coasts therefore had two: one is hinterland, and the other is the foreland, right? So you need to understand coastal settlements as an interplay between the hinterland, which is away from the coast towards the interior, and the foreland, that is the maritime and the marine space and the sea. And finally, I feel that works of scholars like Andrew Bauer has significance, in terms of our geoarchaeological research, right? So because one can, for example, at Bahiri, the dunes that we see, when we excavated, we found that these dunes are not purely natural, but they are also anthropogenic. Something that Andrew Bauer has repeatedly talked about and mentioned in his paper, that many of these geoarchaeological features has also anthropogenic intrusions, right? And in the context of coastal region of Bengal, one can investigate these relations through changes in the land use patterns, right, which are mediated through historical and social requirements, right? And finally, archaeological settlements in coastal West Bengal can contribute towards debates on Anthropocene. There's a lot of debate going on where we should begin our Anthropocene. Should it be in the 20th century, or can it be taken even back in time? So, looking at the geoarchaeological sedimentary matrix at Edenda, for example, as I showed you, that people in the protohistoric phase, they were using soil from a deposit, from the Shijua deposit, which was non-anthropogenic, but using it to make their floors, right? So the Anthropocene can be pushed back than it is accepted today. And finally, archaeology can also contribute towards understanding of landscape and habitat distractions, right? So coastal zones are primarily, they are subjected to landscape destructions and also habitat destructions. And I will end with one small video, right, which shows how an island, it is not in Midnapur, it is in Sundarban region, which we recently visited. Now, this island has been recorded in the colonial period as Halliday Island, which was a hunting ground, right? And we are finding artifacts from this island. But just look at the island's condition now. So this is how coastal habitats are getting destroyed. So how do we study them is a matter of our jurisprudence. I'll leave you with this video. Yeah. So this is the island of Halliday. So as you can see, this was, densely forested even 100 years earlier. But just look at this situation now, and we are finding artifacts from this particular island, which may date back even earlier than the colonial period. So obviously, acknowledgements, my students, some of who are possibly here. Chandriba, I have named some of them, but there are other students, including my MS students, my collaborators, and the people of the sites where I work. And thank you again to the IITGN, particularly Dr. Prabhakar and Dr. Sharada for inviting me. I hope I have been able to make some sense, and I'll be happy to take questions from you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kaushik. It was a very, very insightful talk. I mean, you have put a spotlight on Bengal, of course, and a part of Bengal, so we can kind of, we can expect that the whole of Bengal will be having so much more interesting evidences, right? This was just a small part that you highlighted, and it is already so rich. And also for highlighting coastal archaeology and its limitations, its challenges, and you have brought in many different ideas here, which I think would be very useful for our listeners today, right from site formation processes to different excavation strategies. You have employed Harris metrics there, and a very different interdisciplinary way of looking at things and studying the evidences from there. So I think this is for the first time that I'm hearing a talk on a coastal area which is bringing out such different aspects about it, and very interesting. And we hope that you carry forward this work and you get many more amazing results from the place. So at this point, I will request our participants to type their comments or questions in the chat box. We also have a Q&A box. I don't know if you can see it, but there is a chat box there which you can use to put in your comments. So I will just briefly ask you one question that, so what are your future plans for this place? I mean, you're obviously conducting excavations. There's a lot of active field work going on there, and looking at these evidences from different lenses. But are you heading towards any other aspect of it, like conservation perhaps? Because you showed that video at the end, which is showing us the precarity of that place, right? So
yes. So yes, I get your question. So basically what I wanted to tell people here is this, that settlements along the coast, as I said, we need to take a long-term perspective. And I feel that we can no longer be restricted only to archaeology, right? Like, for instance, the island I showed you, it was used in the colonial, it is mentioned as Halliday Island, right? It was a sanctuary, actually, where people would go for tiger hunting, right? Even 150 years ago. But look what has happened to it. So what we are trying to do here now is trying to use archaeological sites as repositories of climatic change. That is one area where we are trying to work. And also, as I said, there are other aspects, network and things that we do in archaeology. But more importantly, I think that in future, some of the settlements will give us the data on the rate of climate change, at least for the past 2000 years, right? And we cannot stop things that are happening, but what are the strategies that one may adopt, particularly from land use perspective, in order to not avert or change. I mean, you cannot intervene too much into climatic change. That's going to happen. But how to save this habitat? How to save the habitat? By saving habitat, I don't only mean a particular area, but also knowledge. For example, I touched upon this issue of salt making.
Yes.
And we do have evidence of salt making from Bangladesh. They have very good data, particularly dates and everything, but we have similar pottery. So I'm sure that it was happening in Bengal as well. Now, as Andrew has talked about in some of his articles, geoarchaeology, we look at geoarchaeology as something purely scientific. But, if you get social science, then you look at salt making, salt as a geological product, but look how power played a role in it, in where, the salt makers, the traditional salt makers were basically stopped by the British colonialists, right? So they were not allowed to make salt. right? The British East India Company, they monopolized salt making. So, there's a question of power again on basically on geological product, right? This is what Andrew has talked about, written about in a few of his articles. So we want to basically look at habitat, right? What could be, what were the practices possibly, right, in coping with these challenges in the coast, because along the coast you have different kind of challenges. For example, you have cyclones, you have your floods, you have other sorts of challenges. How people coped with these challenges, and if we can use some of this knowledge in order to inform the local communities, because what's important is to remember, and I thought that I could tell this to the participants as well, that don't look at the archaeological site as something in the past. It's been formed in the present. People are living around it. They look at the objects. So if those sites, the knowledge that we get from the site, if they can be used in certain way to help the local people, to kind of facilitate them, that would be nice actually, and that's what we are trying to do. That's why we are trying to collaborate with environmental scientists and other scientists in order to make it sustainable, as we call this.
These are very important takeaways. I mean,
yes,
considering that these are climate disaster prone areas and quite vulnerable, and
yes,
but they are also, they are safeguarding these ancient, like what we call indigenous knowledge systems of mitigating these challenges and surviving through it, and creating these records.
Yes, and what is most important here is to remember is also this, that again, I'll go back to Andrew Bower and his or even social science, not only Andrew Bower, but many social scientists and archaeologists have talked about, is the question of power. If you read the colonial records, they would say that this entire coast was uninhabited, right? Okay, I mean,
that's a different
not live here,
yeah.
right? But excavations, they show that site like Bahiri, it was a thriving site. It's not only just the port that we are talking about. Tamluk, for example, has been labeled as a port, and Sharada, that this is something that we are learning from our school college days. Arikamedu and Tamluk and port and Indo-Roman trade. Of course, these are important, but how did people live? How did they could sustain a very large community? So we are trying to understand this community from the artifacts and structures, not just about the Indo-Roman trade. That is again a colonial historiography which we need to address critically. I'm not saying it's not important, but we need to have a critical address for this, this issue of Indo-Roman trade and the colonial historiography. Yes.
So I see some questions in the Q&A box, which is from the participant Shweta Handigol. So there are 4 or 5 questions, but I think the most important ones among this, the first one is a very obvious one: why is it important to learn or study coastal archaeology? Yes. But I think we can take up the other 2, which is, what's the difference really between marine archaeology and coastal archaeology, if there are any differences? And again, differences between coastal and land archaeology. So if you can touch upon that.
I think they're good questions. Thank you. So marine archaeology, as far as my understanding goes, it talks about archaeology that's happening below the water, right? I mean, you need a different strategy for that. You need to dive. Coastal archaeology, and that is what I tried to say in my lecture, in the course of my lecture, this intertidal archaeology, something that we don't hear about it much in India, but if you are traveling outside India, in UK, for example, there's a lot of intertidal archaeology that goes on. So that's part of coastal archaeology, where archaeological objects are below the water for some part of the day, but at other times they're above the water, above the tidal level. So this intertidal zone, particularly now in an area like, some work has been done in Gujarat, I'm aware of it, right, of intertidal zone in Gujarat. They have been published in Man and Environment, but I think in coastal areas of Bengal and also other parts of India, right, this intertidal zone is a very important area which we need to survey. We haven't really surveyed the intertidal zone, particularly in a place like Bengal, where we have a river like Ganges and high diurnal tidal range throughout the day. So that is coastal archaeology, and coastal archaeology is basically not only about the marine aspect of it, but also it has been defined as an area where the tide goes in. So if you see what's a coast, it's basically places where the tide can reach, right? So it's a liminal landscape. It's an in-between landscape between the sea and the land. That's a coast, right? The littoral is on the sea, If I can, if this possibly satisfies the participant, the littoral is basically near the sea, but the coast is, it can go further, several kilometers, even hundreds of kilometers away from the sea, till the tide goes. And in a place like Bengal, the tide travels hundreds of kilometers inside. So we have a large coastal zone, at least in this part of the country, and also Bangladesh is also, of course, part of it. They have a very long coastline and coastal zone. Yeah. So
lot of scope there because we have a very long coastline and
yes. Yeah.
So there is another question from an anonymous participant who asks that you have mentioned that you observed rolled potsherds in the sediments. What is the significance of studying rolled pottery in the sediments? What do they essentially suggest? Like, for example, the lithics that are rolled or angular, they can give us an idea about the sediments that were deposited at that time or later. Is it the same for potsherds? Can they tell us about sediment deposition formation, site formation?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. It's a very important question. And as I said that, we have studied rolling of lithic artifacts, and we were aware about the literature. But pottery, for example, also experiences the same kind of rolling if it travels in water. Or not only water, there are other aspects. Even weathering of pottery leads to, pottery, because it's made up of softer material, it rolls under different conditions, right? So rolling would indicate obviously disturbance, right? So one correlation would be basically if you get unrolled pottery in mint condition, that would mean that particular surface has not been disturbed, either fluvially or otherwise, right? So that is one conclusion you can draw from it, right? So and there is only a few papers by Skibo and others who have actually studied rolling of pottery quantitatively by using a chart from a geologist called Krumbe, right? And one can also use that chart, which I have used. And for this, I acknowledge Professor S.N. Rajguru, who actually told me that you should undertake this because nobody has done this in India. That people have talked about rolling of lithic artifacts, but even pottery, okay, they do get rolled. So if you get lots of rolled pottery, for example, on certain islands, we do get rolled pottery, completely rolled pottery. And then it is difficult for us to understand whether it has been transported, locally disturbed, etc., etc. But if you have a degree of rolling, as I said, rolling of different degrees as clasts, sedimentary clasts, then one can understand the degree of rolling, how far that particular site, from perspective of site formation, how far that site has been disturbed. You can quantify that. So that, I think, is the importance of study of rolled pottery.
There is another question from Niladri Karmakar who asks, so this is a very general query, that if this kind of geoarchaeological study is possible in active floodplains like in Sundarban fringes, which date to mid to late Holocene period, if such studies can be done there.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I have touched upon it, and we are actually undertaking some geoarchaeological studies, including stabiliscope studies, etc., which have been done by my collaborators. But more importantly, Niladri, I think what we must remember is this, that geoarchaeology is not pure science. There's a lot of anthropogenic activities happening. So when you look at an archaeological stratigraphy, right, at times things there, as I showed you in that Erinda thing, we were not understanding why is an old surface appearing in a relatively younger surface, right? Then we understood that it's basically anthropogenic. People have actually brought those soils because they found the old soils are more suitable for making the floor of their houses, right? Okay, rather than on the sediments on which they were living, the contemporary sediment. So we have to remember that geoarchaeology, particularly for the last 2,000 years, when we do it in the late Holocene period, it is always tempered, mediated by people. So we actually don't understand the anthropogenic activities which may have led to certain geomorphological changes, and that accentuates, that is augmented as you come later in time, as you come younger in time. For example, creating dams, for example, has changed the entire coastal drainage, particularly from the colonial period. So how do you study colonial sites? How do you study late sites? Because they've been subjected to anthropogenic changes. So geoarchaeology, again, particularly of the late Holocene, mid to late Holocene, is particularly very difficult, challenging from that perspective. Any more questions?
I don't see any other questions. I have one more question.
Yes.
Well, two questions. One is, have you found any evidence of trade from other regions around, like Southeast Asia, for example, in these sites? And second thing is, when you study historical early medieval period or later medieval period, what kind of texts have you looked into to corroborate the archaeological
Yeah.
evidences?
So to answer your first question, yes, we have the evidence of connection with Southeast Asia. Artifacts, for example. Of course, you get the natural, related ware, etc., and the gold foil glass beads, etc. But we also get, and this has been published in recently by us in this Journal of Archaeological Science reports. So we have not only typological but also geochemical and physiochemical similarities with artifacts which we collected from Myanmar, right? And that study has not been published. If I can share that paper with some of you, that really looks at pottery from other places in India along the east coast, but from Bahiri and as also from Bengal, we do get physiochemical signatures of connections with other parts of Bay of Bengal, such as Myanmar, Southeast Asia. Typologically, yes. Even in the recent reports by Berenice Bellina, if you see how they have the pottery that are typologically very similar to the pottery that we are getting, right? So we are in constant discussion with people who are working in Southeast Asia, but like Berenice and also Selva Kumar from Tamil University. So there is, of course, a great deal of similarity. So it's not just related ware now. Previously, it used to be only related ware, but now it's like a range of pottery that are similar between Southeast Asia, Bengal, and along the East Coast, right? That is one thing. And the second one is the literature. Yes, for the historical period, we have a plethora of literature, particularly on Tamluk, or Tamralipti. Okay, you get a whole lot of literature on Tamralipti, dating from, they are datable to even earlier periods in the early historic, like it has been mentioned in Ptolemy's map, or it has also been mentioned in Periplus, possibly as Gange. But right from the 5th century, you get a lot of literature such as Mahavamsa, and then you have this Dasakumara Charita, Dasakumara Charit, and lots of literature in ancient Indian literature texts that talk about Tamralipti as a port, and also Xuanzang or Yuanzang, Faxian, Itzing, all of them, these people, they have come to Tamralipti, right, which is identified with modern Tamluk. But again, I did not touch upon it because that is one area where it's kind of it's a priori designation of a site as a port. So yes, Tamluk is one port, or Tamralipti is one name, right, from coastal Bengal that appears in texts, in inscriptions till about 17th century, right?
Okay, so I think we have taken most of the questions, and
Yes.
thank you for patiently answering each one of them. But
Yeah,
you
I hope I've been able
really,
to answer them to your
yes,
satisfaction.
yes,
Yes.
very much so. And I think it's amazing how you're bringing so many different aspects together to study this particular area. And we really thank you for sparing your time and for this wonderful presentation, and for turning up on a Saturday evening. So I also thank our participants for always being there in good numbers, and they are following this webinar series for quite a few years now, and we kind of come together every last Saturday of the month for these very interesting talks. So thank you, Dr. Kaushik, and I
Thank you. Thank you.
hope that I can see many of you again. Our centers can see many of you again the next last Saturday, that is March month's last Saturday, for another wonderful talk for this series. As I mentioned already, the talks are available on our institute's YouTube channel. Even this one will be shortly. So stay tuned, and we'll see you again next month. So thank you, Dr. Kaushik, and have a good weekend.
Yeah.
And thank you to the participants.
I wish all the participants a good weekend. And
yeah.
Yes.
Thank you.
And thank you for conducting these lectures. I also attend many of them. So
yes.
I hope you and Dr. Prabhakar continue with this
yes.
in the future as well.
Yeah. He's there, but I think he's
but he cannot communicate.
Unmute himself, right?
Yes.
But thank you so much for being there, and then we hope to see you again, all of you, next month. So have a good weekend, and bye-bye. So I'll end the talk here now.